why do bad things happen to good people?
Where are you?
Man, I can't go past pain and suffering.
I'd probably ask him, what's the point?
Is heaven really real?
Hello, and thank you for clicking on this video. My name is Tom, and I'm the pastor at Grace Generation Church. Before we start, could you just send me a text or an email that says, I watched? That's really the only way I know who is watching. My email is pastortom@gracegenerationchurch.net, and you can text me at 509-291-8404. Last fall, we looked at a few hymns and dug into the theology behind those hymns. It was a series that I called Hymns About Him. I really enjoyed teaching on those hymns, and along the same lines, over the next few weeks, I want us to look at some old Sunday school songs and do the same thing. Now, if you're over 50 and grew up in the church, you'll know every one of the songs that we're going to be looking at. If you're younger than that, or maybe you didn't grow up in church, you're probably familiar with at least some of the songs we're going to be looking at. Quite possibly the one that we're looking at today. It's a song called He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. This is a song that's been around for a long time, and although its origin is somewhat disputed, most people attribute it to a man named Obie Philpot. Obie was a full-blooded Cherokee Native American, and it's said that he wrote the song while he was in training for the military during World War II. When he was deployed, he left the lyrics to the song in a locker, and someone found them and managed to get the song on the radio while he was at war. Since that day, it's been sung by a number of popular singers, and it's made its way into some major motion pictures. But most of all, it's been sung by countless children in Sunday schools, kid churches, and kids' camps. Let's listen to the song right now.
He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the itty bitty baby in his hands. He's got the itty bitty baby in his hands. He's got the itty bitty baby in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
It's a simple song with a very comforting message. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother. He's got the itty-bitty babies. He's got everything in his hands. It reminds us that we have an all-powerful God who is able to protect us from all kinds of difficulties and hardships. It reminds us of the powerful promise from Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? What can harm us? God has us in his hands. This is the picture that's painted for us by the prophet Isaiah in the 40th chapter of that book. Let's start with Isaiah 40:12. Who else has the oceans in his hand? Who has measured off the heavens with his fingers? Who else knows the weight of the earth or has weighed the mountains and hills on a scale? The answer to these questions are rhetorical. No one else has. God has no equal. All power lies in him. He is an all-powerful God. In verse 14 it says, has the Lord ever needed anyone's advice? Does he need instruction about what is good? Did someone teach him what is right or show him the path of justice? Again, the answer is no. He is the one who created good. He taught us what is good, and he's the one that created right. and he alone knows the path to perfect justice. Then in verse 15 and 17, for all the nations of the world are but a drop in the bucket. They are nothing more than dust on the scales. He picks up the whole earth as though it were a grain of sand. Before him all the nations are nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. Verse 26 says, look up into the heavens. Who created all the stars? He brings them out like an army, one after the other, calling each by its name. Because of his great power and incomparable strength, not a single one is missing. And in verses 22 through 24, God sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to him. He spreads out the heavens like a curtain and makes his tent from them. He judges the great people of the world and brings them all to nothing. They hardly get started before taking root when he blows on them and they wither. The wind carries them off like chaff. What an amazing description. God is God and there is nothing or no one like him. Isaiah is trying to describe the indescribable. He's telling us that we can't even begin to understand how powerful and majestic God is. And if he's all of that, and if he's for us, well, who can stand against us? He's got the whole world in his hands. The Old Testament talks about the hand of God often. Let me give you just one example. How many of you know what Tuesday, November 8th, 2022 is? For those of you who don't know, it's Election Day. It's the infamous midterm elections. Now, I know there are a lot of people who are looking with hope to that day, and there are some people who are fearful of that day. A lot can happen. There could be a lot of changes in Congress and maybe even some state offices. As an American and as a Christian, I have my preferences of who I'd like to see elected. I think every eligible person should take the responsibility and vote. Men and women have sacrificed and died so that you have the right, and I believe that we dishonor them when we simply can't be bothered to make the effort to vote. But as I've said many times, our hope isn't in any politician. In fact, God can change a politician to serve his purposes, even if I don't think he should be in office. Listen to what the hand of the Lord can do. Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart, or a politician's heart, is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes. See, this tells us that God's in charge. God has the heart of every elected official in his hand, and he will direct them. Just like someone carving out a riverbed so that the flow of water changes and goes where they want it to, so God is in control. He's got the whole world in his hands. Or does he? I think that's a fair question. Does God really have the whole world in his hands? Robert Browning, a poet in the 19th century, wrote a poem that ended with these two lines. God's in his heaven, all is right in the world. That sounds good. The only problem is, it's not true. God is in heaven, but not all is right in the world. We only have to turn on the news or the radio, and we'll find out there are terrorists and tyrants and powerful drug cartels. We can see many who live in poverty and don't have enough to eat. Most of us, or someone close to us, has had personal experience with a thief or a rapist or someone intent on killing or causing them bodily harm. Yes, God is in his heaven, but not everything is right in the world. It's the problem of suffering. It's the challenge of experiencing pain. It's a struggle many Christians have. In fact, down through the centuries, since the church was birthed on the day of Pentecost, it's something that theologians have struggled with and debated and discussed. How can we serve a God who has the whole world in his hands, an almighty, all-knowing God, if he either can't or won't put an end to human suffering? And different religions have attempted to resolve this question in different ways. Religions of the East, like Hinduism, teach that human suffering is the result of the sins of the person who is suffering. It's not God's fault. People suffer because they're getting what they deserve. They have somehow offended a God in one of their past lives, or they've done something wicked in a previous existence. So they have to keep coming back again and again, They call it reincarnation. The only way to deal with it is to hopefully work off their guilt so the suffering somehow stops. Islam looks at it differently. For the Muslim, the solution is Allah has willed it. And so you must learn to accept His will without question. In other words, you can't know. It's just your lot in life, so don't ask the question. I think the concept of pain and suffering is a difficult one, but I think it's one worth struggling with. How is it that we see people who love God endure great tragedies in their lives, so much so that their faith is shaken? They become so overwhelmed by the unfairness of what they see that they turn against God. They shake their fist towards heaven and say, God, if you allow such things to happen, then I don't ever want to have anything to do with you again. Several years ago, a rabbi by the name of Harold Kushner had a son who was born with an incurable disease and died before his 14th birthday. That shook Rabbi Kushner's faith. I can relate to that. There is nothing I have experienced in life that shook my faith more than having a child face a life-threatening disease or having a child die. That, in my experience, is the worst kind of pain and suffering. Well, Rabbi wrote a book about his journey. The title of that book is Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? If you're old enough, you may have read it because it became a bestseller. The answer he came to is that God is limited in His power, and therefore He is not a participant in our lives. Instead, He is a spectator watching us with interest. He said God wants to see good things happen to people, but He can't always arrange it. His conclusion is that God is not all-powerful, and that we ought to understand that and love God anyway and forgive Him for His shortcomings. There's a problem with that conclusion. It simply doesn't line up with Scripture. The Bible clearly says God is all-powerful. He has no shortcomings. But if that's the truth, then what about pain and suffering? Well, the Bible shows us that mankind deals with and has dealt with this problem of suffering and pain for a long time. It's filled with accounts of great men and women who faced terrible hardship and pain in their lives. All you have to do is read the book of Job, and you will see that Job experienced pain and suffering in his life, though none of it was his fault. In Genesis, we read about the son of Jacob named Joseph. He was rejected and hated by his own brothers. They sent him on a journey of suffering when they sold him into slavery. And then he ends up in a prison, even though he was completely innocent. Then there's Ruth. She marries a man and moves away from her home. Then she experiences the death of her father-in-law, her brother-in-laws, and even her own husband. She ends up a widow living with her mother-in-law, Naomi, in a foreign land. These are real people who face real tragedies and suffering. Even Jesus warned us that we would experience suffering. In John 16:33, He said, "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows." And then in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, starts out by describing all these great acts of faith and deliverance in the lives of people like Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. But then in the last few verses, the writer talks about people who experienced incredible pain and suffering. Hebrews 11:36 and 37 says, some were jeered at, their backs were cut open with whips, others were chained in prison, some died by stoning, some were sawn in half, and others were killed with a sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. I've said all this to say that the Bible doesn't ignore suffering. It in no way sugarcoats the pain we experience. So how does it hang together? How can the Bible say that we have this all-powerful God, yet say that there is pain and suffering? What's the explanation? Well, let me just say that one thing the Bible doesn't do is trivialize it. What I mean is that the Bible doesn't give us a simple answer. It's not like, here it is in a nutshell, one size fits all. It's not an easy question, and there's not a simple answer. For instance, we see in the suffering of Joseph, God used it to develop and shape his character. And in the end, God uses Joseph to save a great many people from starvation. So sometimes our pain and suffering develops and shapes our character. Another thing we see in Scripture is that sometimes pain and suffering are the result of opposition and persecution from others. Those who knowingly or unknowingly are being used as tools of the enemy in his attempt to steal, kill, and destroy everything that God holds dear. One of the most common reasons the Bible tells us that pain and suffering occur is because of sin. This is especially evident in the Old Testament in the relationship between the nation of Israel and God. Look at what it says in Isaiah 42. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Tell her that her sad days are gone and her sins are pardoned. Yes, the Lord has punished her twice over for all her sins. Now, things are different in the new covenant. God does not punish us for our sin because all of that punishment has been laid on Jesus at the cross. He has paid it all. But what we see in suffering is that sin is at the core of it. Understand this. Sin is when we say, God, I'm going to do things my way, what I think is best, even if it doesn't line up with what you say I should do. See, God created the world and everything in it. He owns it. It's His possession. We know that Jesus holds it all together. And Jesus defeated Satan and death when He was resurrected on that third day. And yet Paul told the Corinthians that somehow, in some way, the enforcement of that victory is ongoing and ever increasing. Look at what he said in 1 Corinthians 15, 25 through 27. For Christ must reign until He humbles all His enemies beneath His feet. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. For the Scriptures say, God has put all things under His authority. That verse tells us that He both has won a complete victory and that the longer He reigns, the more His enemies are subdued. Now, I can't totally explain how that is, but in a sense it means because of sin, because we have an enemy who is still using deceit and deception to lie to people, sin still causes pain and suffering. And in that sense, God doesn't have the whole world in His hands. There are a lot of believers who fail to understand this. And because they don't understand it, they become disillusioned and confused, and way too many of them end up turning away from God. Let me illustrate what I'm trying to say with a story. There was a professor of philosophy who had always challenged his students with this question: did God create everything that exists? Invariably, there would be some student who would bravely say, yes, He did. God created everything. The professor would then repeat the question, and the student would repeat his answer. Yes, sir, He certainly created everything. Then the professor would say, well, if God created everything, then God created evil. And since evil exists, and according to the principle that our works define who we are, then we can assume that God is evil. He used this argument for years to undermine the Christian teachings that some of his students had. But one time, something different happened. One time, one of his students challenged him and asked, Professor, does cold exist? What kind of question is this? He replied. Of course it exists. Have you never been cold? The young man replied, in fact, sir, cold does not exist. According to the laws of physics, what we consider cold is in reality the absence of heat. Absolute zero is negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit and is the total absence of heat, and all matter becomes inert and incapable of reaction at that temperature. Cold in reality does not exist. Rather, we have created that word to describe how we feel when we have less heat. The student continued, Professor, does darkness exist? The professor laughed. Of course it does. Once again, you are wrong, sir. Darkness does not exist either. Darkness is in reality the absence of light. Light we can study, darkness we cannot. You can measure the amount of light present, but you can't measure the amount of darkness present. Darkness really means there's no light present. Finally, the young man asked the professor, Sir, does evil exist? Now, uncertain, the professor responded, Of course. As I've already said, we can see it every day in the daily examples of man's inhumanity to man. It is in the multitude of crime and violence that we see everywhere in the world. These are manifestations of nothing but pure evil. To this, the student replied, I submit to you that evil does not exist, or at least does not exist unto itself. Evil is simply the absence of something. It is the absence of God. Evil is the result of what happens when man does not have God's love in his heart. It's like the cold that comes when there is no heat, or the darkness that comes when there is no light. The point being that God does not cause evil to happen. He is not the author of pain and suffering. Rather, evil and pain and suffering is what happens because so much of the world is still under control of the enemy. There are multitudes of people who refuse to be in God's hands. But wait a minute, Pastor, if God is so all-powerful, why doesn't he just sweep down and remove all the taints of sin? I mean, if the sinfulness of mankind lies at the heart of our suffering and pain in this world, why not, with one powerful stroke, annihilate every sinful person on the earth? Well, the Bible tells us in Romans 3:23 that everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. See, if that is the way God chose to deal with suffering and pain, then none of us would be here. None of us would meet that standard, and we would all be swept away as God cleaned the world of all impurity. The beauty of Isaiah 40 is that it contrasts the suffering of God's people with the power and majesty of their God. And right in the middle of the chapter, Isaiah begins to prophesy about the coming of one who redeems all our pain and suffering. The one who can take what the enemy meant for evil and turn it to his glory and good. Look at Isaiah 40, verses 9 through 11. O Zion, messenger of good news, shout from the mountaintops. Shout it louder, O Jerusalem. Shout and do not be afraid. Tell the towns of Judah, your God is coming. Yes, the sovereign Lord is coming in power. He will rule with a powerful arm. He's telling us that Jesus will come in power. He will come and be our ruler, and he will set all things right. Every bit of evil that has been done will be dealt with. And I don't know about you, but I look forward to that day. No more tears or sorrow, no more pain and suffering. A wonderful paradise where God's will is always carried out perfectly. But I want you to look at what it goes on to say. See, he brings his reward with him as he comes. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will carry the lambs in his arms, holding them close to his heart. He will gently lead the mother sheep with her young. Do you see what the reward is? To be fed by Jesus when we are hungry, to be carried by him when we are weary and tired, to be held close to his heart when ours is breaking, and to be lovingly led by him when we are lost. Suffering will produce, if we allow it, an intimacy with God that nothing else can. Suffering is not fun. It's not what God intended for his creation to experience. But from the time of Adam and Eve, sin entered the world, and with it, pain and suffering. And men and women have sinned and sinned again and again to this day. Paul told us in Romans 8 that our world was damaged and perverted because of sin, and that it has been and is still groaning because it longs to see that day when it will join God's children in being free from suffering. He says that as we share in the glory of Jesus, we must also share in his sufferings. But then he says, don't worry about that, because when you get to your real home, nothing will compare to it. Let me close with reading Romans 8, 18 through 23. Yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory he will reveal to us later. For all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who his children really are. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. For we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And we believers also groan, even though we have the Holy Spirit within us as a foretaste of future glory. For we long for our bodies to be released from sin and suffering. We too wait with eager hope for the day when God will give us our full rights as his adopted children, including the new bodies he has promised us. What a promise that is. Friends, there is coming a day when we will join with all the believers throughout time, and we will rule and reign with Jesus in a kingdom void of pain and suffering. I trust that you know him and you are assured of your future with him. If you're not, if you have any questions about what we've looked at today, please just send me an email or a text and I'll do whatever I can to help you. My email is pastortom@gracegenerationchurch.net, or you can contact me by a text at 509-291-8404. I'd also love to meet you in person at one of our in-person gatherings. We meet at 5601 West Clearwater Avenue, Suite 103 in Kennewick every Sunday at 10 a.m. Remember that Christ has purchased your redemption by experiencing the suffering of the cross, and he has promised to never leave us alone in our times of trouble. He has said that when we go through deep waters, he will be with us, and he will not let it sweep over us. He said that when we walk through fire, we will not be burned. Whatever it is that you're facing today, lean into him and find your comfort there.